My name is Kirsty Warland, and I've been in tech sector now for about 20 years, just over 20 years. So, so I'm going to talk to you about leading with empathy and inclusion, and essentially creating environments where people can thrive in organisations. Like many of you have said, it's a topic close to people's hearts. I'm going to give you some stats as well, so that hopefully you can see that it makes good business sense and it's not just a nice to have. So as an example, just to kick off, I was looking at some reports. So DDI Global Leadership Forecast, for example, they shared that 77% of organisations report a leadership gap, especially in inclusivity. I think that kind of echoes some of the feelings people have shared already. Deloitte have shared that only 29% of employees actually trust their leaders or managers. Now, that's a massive 17% reduction on stats that they took in 2022, where they reported 46% of employees trusted their leaders. And a really staggering $8.8 trillion annually is lost in productivity as a result of disengaged employees. I'm sure you'll kind of say that they're quite worrying numbers. And for me, leading with empathy and inclusion, it's a no-brainer. It's not just a nice to have, it's an essential foundation for building high-performing teams. And I think for me, it's all within your gift to do that. And it's just about building consistent practices and being mindful about how we approach our.
You've gone on mute there, Kirsty.
Sorry about that. I think I'm just trying to work between not being my teams as well. So I'm going to cover off a little bit about why it matters, how inclusion and empathetic leadership might show up in the workplace, the impact it can have, and some of the practical habits that leaders can build into their everyday working life. And hopefully you get to share some stories along the way. Oh, dearie me. We're just trying to navigate this. Okay. Have we moved on slide?
We have.
Love a bit
Before
of
we move on,
technology.
Kirsty, there was one question from Kathleen that was,
Yeah.
was there a primary source for that data in the beginning that you mentioned those stats?
Yes. So the Gallup one is around $8.8 trillion lost annually. So Gallup State of the Global Workplace report. I have got these on a slide at the end for people to be able to go back and look at. Deloitte Human Capital Trends of 2023 and DDI Global Leadership Forecast of 2023. So those were the stats, those were the sources that I've taken those stats from.
Perfect,
okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So just thinking about why it matters. Well, inclusive leaders create belonging. And if people feel safe, they feel valued and included, then they can build a trust in their leaders. And empathetic leaders help to build that trust and confidence by being authentic and fair. Trust underpins collaboration and actually creates a more resilient workforce. And it's where you bring those two together, that high levels of, with high levels of belonging and high levels of trust, that you create additional motivation, innovation can start to flourish, and you see a more sustainable performance and sustainable results. And just thinking about when people feel valued and accepted for who they are, they show up as their best selves. They show up with enthusiasm and motivation. When you build that trust with authentic leaders, being fair and empathetic, and when they really listen and follow through with their colleagues, with their teams, it creates a glue that enables that collaboration. And it's where we bring those two together when belonging and trust are strong, that performance isn't forced. And that then feeds into those high-performing teams that become a bit more of a buzzword lately, where teams innovate more, they're more committed, they deliver sustainable results. So it is really about the overlap of those circles where inclusion, empathy has its greatest impact in the performance of others. And it's really about creating that ability for organisations to thrive a bit more. Before I move on, any questions around that? Any thoughts people might have shared? Any experiences of bringing those three together? Okay. I want to talk about why it builds that foundation, and the way that I kind of visualize it is in a pyramid with high performing teams at the top. What theory tells us is that people derive part of their identity and self-esteem from group membership. And it is where that inclusive leader helps to strengthen the belonging. It helps to reduce the divide, and it does increase that collaboration. And where leading with empathy can support motivation factors like recognition, increased responsibility, increased growth, and that in turn drives that engagement and performance. So really for me, leading with empathy and inclusion is more about creating an environment where all voices are heard, not just the loudest. We've all been in situations where, somebody takes over that meeting, and those voices that are quieter or the more reflective colleagues are just not heard. Well, by leading with empathy and inclusion, you actually make room for all voices, and not just the majority of the most senior voices. And as a leader, it's our responsibility to actively invite people into the conversation where we actively value or amplify diverse perspectives. And I think this is what, for me, signals to team members that speaking up is welcomed, it's respected, and that's where you get more voices heard in the room. I want to come back to trust. As we can see, that builds with that trust and collaboration. One of the observations I would share is that low trust actually undermines culture. And that's because, for me, trust is the foundation of team performance. If you undermine trust, then, or if you don't have high levels of trust within your team, they're less willing to speak up, they're less willing to share ideas. They may have to ask permission for everything. They may feel that they work in a blame culture, so they're not able to admit mistakes, and you lose out on that growth and that learning from that. They might not take risks, so that drives down the ability to innovate. They might not ask for help and therefore, create a sense of community. They might not feel valued for contributions or their skills. More importantly, they don't trust their team or leadership. And the theory tells us that teams perform better when team members feel safe to take risks without fear and punishment. Amy Edmondson undertook a lot of research on psychological safety. And again, I include her reference at the end. And she said that psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And that's a really, really important facet to high performing teams. McKinsey and Deloitte research, for example, suggests that diverse and inclusive teams far outperform others by up to 35%. They're far more innovative, they're far more financially savvy. There's a lot more return by being inclusive and by being empowered to actually work and trusted to do the work. So the theories tell us that inclusion creates psychological safety. That's underpinned by Edmondson with the social identity theory. Empathy builds trust and motivation. There's lots around that with Maslow, Hertzberg, Goleman, and combined, these approaches have the potential to unlock that sustained high performance, and that's underpinned by your transformational or your servant leadership. McKinsey, Deloitte also feed into that. So hopefully you'll see that it's all underpinned by a lot of theory, and it's about putting that into practice. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what inclusive leadership might look like and what empathetic leadership might look like. But before I do that, have we got any questions, Kevin?
Nothing in the chat yet. So But if anybody does want to ask any questions, feel free to now, or make any comments on the points that Kirsty's raised.
No, it's all quiet, stunned silence. We're not used to stunned silence, Kevin. I must admit.
Right, they'll warm up soon, don't worry, Kirsty.
Thank you. So what does inclusive leadership look like? So in my mind, inclusive leadership is my everyday behaviours. For me, it's about making sure that everybody feels valued, they feel heard, they're able to contribute. And I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of is inclusive leadership's not just about ticking the boxes on the policy, it's about how you show up on a day-to-day basis. So thinking about what it might look like in practice, meetings where quieter voices are invited in rather than talked over. We talked a little bit about that earlier on. A lot of people talk about recruitment and promotions. Inclusive leadership makes sure that that's based on clear criteria. It's not just about gut feel, and that leaders acknowledge bias, they actively work to counter it, they celebrate different backgrounds and strengths and perspectives because they realise that by bringing all of that together, it enables people to thrive, and they ask questions to seek to understand rather than work with predetermined assumptions. If we move on to what empathetic leadership looks like, that's about going beyond sympathy. It's not, I feel for you. It's, I'm seeking to understand your experience. I'm seeking to respond meaningfully. It's about leading with understanding. It's about bringing that humanity and that connection into your interactions with your colleagues, with your teams. One of the important things for me was that leading with empathy isn't about fixing people's problems. It's just more about creating that space where they feel seen, they feel understood, they feel supported. So what it looks like in practice for me is I might notice that a colleague is quieter than usual, and, you know, I might check in with them saying, you know, I've noticed you're not yourself. Is there anything you need? Sometimes I've adjusted workloads temporarily for somebody who's been balancing care and responsibilities, or might have something going on in their home life that wasn't expected. I think an important aspect is that you might recognise that team members may experience the same event differently. And I think that's even more important these days, where we're becoming more aware of neurodivergence and the different protected characteristics that people are dealing with a lot of things in their personal life, but also they experience things like change, like redundancy, like new systems or processes very differently. So an empathetic leader will try and tailor their support based on that. I talked a little bit about active listening before, giving people the space to share without interruption. So you know, you might say something like, I don't fully understand what you're going through, but I'm here to listen and support you. And actually listening to understand, you don't have to have a reply, you don't have to have words of wisdom, but you can sit alongside them and just listen. Thinking about how other people's perspectives, especially when their experiences differ from your own, can influence how they act or influence how they might show up. And how this might feel from their point of view. And lots more. But I think more importantly, it's about showing it's okay to not have all of the answers. So for me, leading with empathy is just like a critical, it's just a basic aspect of building trust, where people really do feel safe to be themselves. And you know, one of the really great benefits of empathetic leadership is it can actually help to reduce burnout, especially if leaders notice and respond before an issue escalates, so that, you know, they're in the moment with the employee, they're putting those adjustments in place and they're thinking about what that might look like for them. As a result, the payback of that is that you might see increased loyalty and engagement because people want to give back when they feel understood. They want to be able to contribute, and they are more motivated when they feel understood because they feel like they have that sense of belonging again. And in turn, that can help to strengthen the team cohesion because it can actually remove or diffuse some conflict and help to create those better connections. I'm going to
We have
pause
a
there
couple
because
of
I've spoken for a
questions,
bit.
Kirsty.
Yeah,
That's
thank
okay.
you.
And again, if you're going to cover this later on, tell us. But we've had one question which is about some practical steps you could make to put into practice what you spoke about. So you spoke about creating a culture of trust, and I think to some degree you've answered this question slightly by some of the things on this slide around you showing vulnerability and you actively listening and things. But the question is, practically speaking, how do you ensure that quieter voices in the room, say for example in a Teams meeting, feel empowered and confident enough to voice their opinions? And then the following question is there any differences to how you do this when the team's remote as opposed to all working together in an office?
Okay, so for me, leading with empathy inclusion isn't a one-off action. It is a set of habits, and I do call out a few practical habits that we can get into, but it's definitely not a one-off action. It does need to be repeated consistently. It doesn't happen overnight. It is something that you help to shape the culture of the team, the culture of the performance over time. So by spending time with your colleagues in check-ins and understand how they really are and listening without rushing, starts to build some of that trust in yourself and some of that connection with your colleagues. But you can think about starting meetings by rotating who speaks first. And to do that, you have to be fully present in those conversations. You have to remember and know who has contributed, who always contributes first, whose voice haven't we heard for a while, so that you actually invite them in. And I did, I mentioned inviting them in to start with. So that does mean that you actually have to work at being that inclusive leader, at paying attention, at acknowledging who is contributing, and then bringing in those who perhaps don't feel as confident. Sometimes that might be as simple as, literally just saying, I haven't quite heard, I haven't heard from Bob. I can see you taking it all in. I can see you processing that information. How are you feeling about it? But also other things around being more inclusive, or some practical things around how you show up to meetings as well. Have you sent that agenda out beforehand? Have you set some consistent practices? Have you read all of the information beforehand? Or have we done what we normally do when we come to the meeting? We're reading through the paperwork as we're going, so therefore we're not bringing our full selves. So it does mean that we need to shift our own selves first and lead by example. As far as doing that in a hybrid in Teams way, it is about more purposeful check-ins. People talk about the loss of the cooler moments, the getting a cup of tea moment. You do have to be more purposeful when you're working remotely. So those check-ins, setting yourself aside some time for those regular check-ins, even if it is a 5 minute, at the start of the day or 5 minute during lunchtime, but it is about being purposeful engagement and engaging purposefully.
And then I'm going to slightly adapt Nadina's question on the assumption that you don't have an answer for it. So the question is, are there any stats on male leaders who are keen to embrace this kind of inclusion and empathetic leadership?
Interestingly,
answer that if you can, yeah.
I didn't segment out the data for male versus female. So the stats that we've got, the stats that I've got, were brought out in an array, the total stats rather than segmented by. But I can do a little bit of research and I can share that back with you, Kevin.
Yeah, if you can do. So on this,
Yeah.
let's assume that this is more likely to be something that female leaders see the value in more than male leaders. You're using stereotypes. I've had questions. How do we then get more male leaders to want to create these cultures? And follow-on question or aligned question, if we are doing this locally in our teams to try and create this culture in our teams, but we're middle leaders, not senior leaders. How do we make sure that actually that is adopted on a larger scale, and then our behaviours at this level aren't resisted by actual culture that's estimated at a more senior level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me answer the second one first, and then I'll come back to the male one if that's okay.
Yeah,
Just
cool.
while I'm percolating. So I think what I've heard is the question is, if we're middle leadership, how do we influence up to ensure that it comes right the way through all levels of the team, rather than just us sitting there on our own trying to create more inclusion and more empathy. So for me, the answer is about making sure that people understand the business benefits. I've just given you some very, very high level stats there. One of the things that really surprised me was how much there is in and around inclusive and empathetic leadership around really creating the business benefits. I think one of the observations I've made is that it is very much seen as a nice to have. It's very much seen as a fluffy skill to bring into the workplace. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is make sure that people understand the actual business benefits. If we go back to one of the first stats that I shared, $8.8 trillion lost on an annual basis as a result of disengagement. You have a lot of organizations who have regular heartbeats around their engagement stats. They celebrate the fact that they might have a 50% engagement. That's still 50% of their workforce that's disengaged. And one of the things that we can start to do is start to create that movement in and around, well, what does that mean for a business? Disengaged colleagues will leave the organization. They will not share ideas. They will go somewhere else where they feel that they can contribute and where they have a sense of belonging. One of the stats that I will share later is around 70% of colleagues state that the leader's behavior is a direct influencer on whether they're engaged or not. So from that perspective, we as leaders need to manage up as well as create that movement of engaged colleagues. And we do that by leading by example. If I turn to the conversation around male, actually, do you know what? One of the things we probably should have done in this is invite some of our male allies into this conversation, because actually the story I would like to share is around one of the greatest, most inclusive and empathetic leaders I've ever worked for, which was a chap called John Morgan. He'll kill me for sharing this. I'm seeing him later, so I'll tell him. As I said earlier, I've been in IT for just over 20 years, and that's as a result of a really generous, kind individual called John Morgan, who saw a potential in me and gave me an opportunity to move into IT. I'd done some work as far as business process mapping. I was business side, I wasn't IT side, and I was really good at it. And an opportunity came up, and I took a chance and I applied, and John Morgan very graciously gave me the job. But more importantly, he listened. He took time to understand me. He took time to understand what some of my challenges were. I am neurodivergent, and he made sure that whatever I needed, I had. And he did that without even thinking. It wasn't an uncomfortable conversation. He encouraged me to go back to school. He encouraged me to do a degree. He encouraged me to do a master's. And actually, he sat as a peer review on my master's dissertations and throughout my master's 2 years. That was because he created a sense of belonging. He understood me as an individual. He created trust and psychological safety. When my dad was going through a really tough time, I felt comfortable to speak up and tell him what I was going through. He adapted himself to me, and when I needed some support, I felt heard. That relationship has lasted 20 years because he created such a great environment to work in. So we really do need to be inviting our male counterparts, and it's not just a fluffy thing, and it's not just a new thing. It's been going for a long time. It's just we're talking about it a lot more now. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty.
No worries.
There's lots of comments in the chat about this,
All right.
which I won't read out or make people repeat, but yeah, you've obviously struck a chord there with a lot of people. So back to the presentation if you wish.
Okay. So I have already kind of touched on some of the impact. And John Morgan is, I think I'm a living example of John Morgan's impact. But just to recap, look, inclusion without empathy, sorry, it's going to be transactional. You've got to create some heart. Empathy without inclusion, it risks being impersonal, it's going to be inconsistent, and it's not sustainable. So bringing that together and creating that culture of fairness, humanity, that's where performance really comes into its own. And I think it is just about making sure that people are valued for who they are, what they bring, and by leaders actively noticing humans, what their needs are, their styles, they can help to reduce that burnout and really create an environment of well-being and engagement. And then the stats then can naturally increase rather than overly focusing on a number. Some of the practical habits we've already touched on, pause, listen. You're not there to always have the answer. I've already said it's consistent, repeated behavior. Doing it all the time will help to shape your culture. It'll help to increase your performance over time. That active listening for me is so important. Acknowledging people's emotions. Don't skip past how people might be feeling, even in business discussions. And if it's not appropriate to talk about it in the session that you're in, check in with them afterwards. How are you? How are you really? Give them space and time. Use that inclusive language. One of my pet hates is the jargon, the acronyms, the assumptions. Try and make your language more inclusive. When you're writing, try and make that writing inclusive. Simple things like sharing your logic, be transparent about why you're making a decision. It can help to reduce those perceptions of bias. And you know what? It's absolutely okay to disagree. Tell them that and mean it. So if you're inviting challenge, you have to mean that it's okay to disagree. You have to listen because sometimes, and quite a lot of the time, people do have really good ideas that you might not have thought of. As we said, it's not always about you having the ideas. Think about who's getting that stretch work. Think about who's getting the visibility. Can you sponsor or mentor someone outside of your usual circle? Because actually, that's going to bring diversity of thought into yourself. You can absolutely ask for feedback. How are you doing? How inclusive are you in practice? Can somebody observe you? It's uncomfortable, but if you find somebody that you trust and you create that psychological safety, like I did with John Morgan, let me tell you, he could be very direct with his feedback during my master's degree, that's for sure. But I felt safe with him. And I think it's really important to create some of those connections where you feel safe as well. But it is about also role modeling that vulnerability, as I said before. Admit your mistakes, share your learning, because actually balancing that with, others being able to make mistakes creates that safety as well. And it is okay to hold high standards, but actually, when life gets in the way, or when people have specific life events, you have to adapt and support them as well. And by doing that, you're building some fairness, you're building confidence, Somebody talked earlier around recruitment and creating more diverse teams. So it is about building some of those inclusive processes and fairness into your recruitment from the get-go. The government do, if you've ever applied for a government job, that you have to take all of your references to, whether you're male or female, or some of those protected characteristics out of it, so that they can assess your CV or your application. Taking names out, taking educational establishments out when you're looking at CVs or you're looking at your recruitment. Build some fairness into your performance, build some peer reviewing. There's lots more that people can do, okay? So just as a call for action to yourselves, really, for me, inclusive and empathetic leadership, for me, isn't about extra work. It is the work. It's the work that you have to go out and do and practice every day. So instead of running from meeting to meeting, create that space, because actually you need to make everyone feel like they belong. You need to make that feeling of trust so that they can perform at their best. Choose empathy, choose inclusion, make it a habit, listen, and hopefully be the leader who creates that safety, not the